Our speaker today is Mr. Kyle Clement. He's the case facilitator and administrator for the Societas Matris Dolorisme, the Society of the Sorrowful Mother. He's worked with exorcists, in particular with Father Chad Rippinger, and support personnel for the last 20 years. Mr. Clement was on the founding committee that formed the Pope Leo XIII Institute for the training of exorcists in the U.S. at the request of the USCCB. He subsequently taught and formed priests as well as their support teams with the Pope Leo XIII Institute for several years. His association with Father Chad Rippinger preceded the founding of the SMD. The society is an order of semi-contemplative exorcist priests and lay assistants that provide law enforcement provide formation and consulting services to cardinals, bishops, exorcists, priests, mental health professionals, and law enforcement agencies in the areas of exorcism and extraordinary diabolical activity. SMD also provides exorcist formation and training for parish priests, mental health professionals, and deliverance teams, following a medical model known as the Liber Christo methodology. Mr. Clement has presented on this topic both domestically and internationally at public conferences, as well as the diocesan convocations and clergy-only training retreats. He's here today to speak with us in a more generalized topic of spiritual combat, of which he is also pretty much an authority on that. So I would encourage everybody, young and old, to listen up, listen to the man. And here he is, Kyle Clement. You have to hold it real close, or you can.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me. Can everyone hear me all right? If you can't hear me, raise your hand.
Can you hear it back there? Back there, can you hear it?
So,
Joshua.
So this is probably about as good as it's going to get. In our work with extraordinary diabolical activity, people often ask a lot of questions, and so what I'll share with you this afternoon is some of the universal truths and some of the things that we found to be a constant across the spectrum, if you will. So to give you an idea of the size of the data set that we deal with, last year I answered over 6,200 inquiries. And so that's everything from, will Father come speak to our legatus group, to I have things levitating in my kitchen. And so it runs the gambit, and there's a methodology of sorting through all of that. So the Society of the Most Sorrowful Mother, the SMD, provides consultant and formation services to bishops, cardinals, priests, even law enforcement, to others with regard to the phenomenon of extraordinary diabolical activity. So the first threshold is essentially to determine whether or not what we're experiencing or what the person is experiencing is extraordinary. And so there's a lot of ordinary activity to which we are having an extraordinary response. What does that mean? It means we're a bunch of snowflakes. It means we're not prepared for any kind of adversity, any kind of resistance, any kind of difficulty in our spiritual life. The spiritual life is combat. And so we are the church militant. We're not the church reticent. We're not the church chilling. We're not the church hanging out. We're the church militant. And so the military language, the language of conflict, of an adversity, is very real language. It's very consistent with what the experience is. So one of the first observations is that the demon, the fallen angel, is the most closely regulated, the most tightly regulated creature in all the universe. He would have you think that he is autonomous, that he comes and goes and does what he pleases. But in fact, there's a very different reality. So let's look at what are the things that regulates his behavior, if you will. The first thing, the first element is his fallen nature. He can't act outside his fallen nature. He can't act in a way that is inconsistent with his fallen nature. So let's talk for a second about his nature. The nature of the demon is the nature of an angel, but perverted or fallen. And so tradition tells us that the fall of angels was precipitated by a single moment, a single pivotal moment in all the cosmos, and that's the kataphragmos, or the incarnation. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And so it is at that moment, at that revelation, that God will take a form, he will be born of a woman, that he will become man, that Lucifer, the creature, makes the statement, non servunum, I will not serve. So the church fathers, specifically our most articulate in this subject is St. Thomas Aquinas, the Angelic doctor, who goes on to expound that essentially what Lucifer is saying is, I will not serve a God who will take a form less than I. The response to this is a voice that declares, Quia sunt Deus? Who can compare to God? This is Michael, a lesser creature that cast Lucifer from the heavens by the absolute truthful statement, who can compare to God? So when you see the image of St. Michael with his sword in the mouth of the dragon, the sword is his statement, who can compare to God, in direct opposition to Lucifer's statement that is contrary to God's holy will. And so that's some of the imagery. But essentially all exorcism follows that formula. The demon yields to the absolute truth of Jesus Christ. So there's his fallen nature. Angels were created mission specific, meaning they were created to do a certain thing. Sometimes that's chronological, sometimes it's sequential, sometimes it operates outside of time, but the angel is created to do a specific thing. In the instance of a fallen angel, he retains his zeal for the mission because that's part of his nature. But instead of it being to augment or enhance the flow of grace through the event, it now becomes his motivation is to impede or block the flow of grace through the same event. So to put this in practical terms, how many angels do you think were created to sing glory to God at the Nativity? Scripture tells us myriads and myriads. The Cowboy translation of the NAB says a bunch. But 1/3 of them now militate against the sanctity of the event. How do they militate against the sanctity of the event? In various ways. One is commercialization. Another one is to shift the focus from the Christ child to ourselves. So in this we see the second predominant feature of the angelic, the demon versus the angelic. So in the angelic paradigm, it is to augment the flow of grace. In the diabolical paradigm, it is to impede or obex the flow of grace. In the angelic paradigm, it is to aid in placing God at the primacy of the focus of the creature. In the diabolical paradigm, it is to supplant and to place the creature in the place of the focal point instead of the creator. Said another way, it is to shift you from being an ad orientem disposition to an ad hominem disposition. Pun intended. Inference intended. So when we shift from an ad orientem, a focus on creator, to a focus on creature, now this opens us for the third aspect of diabolical spiritual warfare, or the third thing, And that is, in order for there to be diabolical affliction, for you to be experiencing extraordinary diabolical affliction, there has to be psychological compatibility with the fallen angel. What is psychological compatibility? It is a point upon which you, as the fallen human, and the fallen angel, the demon, agree. It's the basis for conversation. So you're going to see an example of that. You're going to see a classic example of that in the fall in the garden, where Eve and the serpent engage in the first ecumenical theological dialogue. And so this is where an opinion that is contrary to God's holy will is elevated to a par with God's holy will. So there's a relationship, there's a conversation. Once that starts, now you are subject to extraordinary diabolical activity because you've allowed, you've taken counsel, or you're in agreement with the demons. Everybody follow that rationale? And so it can be pretty subtle. It can be the language of Luciferianism, which is the language of entitlement. You deserve a better father, a better mother, a better life experience. You deserve. These people don't understand you. Fill in the blank. Has anyone ever heard those? All of us hear them from time to time. The question is, how do we respond? If you respond with thanksgiving, if your primary response is one of thanksgiving for your current condition or whatever you may be experiencing, then the psychological compatibility is broken. Because the drumbeat of the demon is criticism. The drumbeat of the demon is accusation. Usually the accusation of God or of other humans, pointing out defects rather than attributes. So if you take those three things in concert, one, he can't act outside his fallen nature. Two, his emphasis is always and everywhere going to be to impede grace, to impede relationship. And three, that there has to be psychological compatibility. Then you've got enough weapons, you've got enough intelligence, intel, if you will, to engage this enemy and be victorious. All the rest of it becomes detail. All the rest of it becomes so much specificity, but the basic rules are the same. And so, while that may sound trite and it may sound easy, it is a life's work. So what we found is as we walk through these cases and we get these large number of inquiries, then there is a necessity to reorder one's life or to impose both order and discipline. The first order of the unseen God is order. What is the first attribute of God is order. He brings cosmos out of chaos. And so, just to give you some visual and some help, maybe in visualizing what I'm saying, is let's view the Trinity. All diabolical attack has as one of its features an attack on the integrity of the Trinity. And so the integrity of the Trinity is extremely important. I think it was wonderful that we had today's Mass and the preface in today's Mass with regard to the reference to the Trinity. But the old weapons are the good weapons, the tried and true weapons. Those are the good weapons. And so, of the three persons of the Trinity, we have Pater Filio Spiritu. The Father is God the Father, the Creator. And so this is the first person of the Trinity, and He is the Creator. And so I want to overlay on this relationship with God the Father the theological virtues. So what is the first theological virtue? Faith. Faith. So if we see the Father as analogous with faith, then we see that faith in God the Father begets, what's the second one? Hope. Hope in Christ the Son. and is manifest or perpetuated through charity. The charity of the Holy Spirit. So if we see these three persons of the Trinity in the specificity of their function, as well as the theological attribute that goes with them, we start to see what is under attack. So if the demon is wanting to project upon you feelings of despair, futility, hopelessness, against whom is this, which person of the Holy Trinity is this attack focused?
Familial.
The Son, precisely. And it's going to give you the insight that this particular demon is going to be most susceptible to this person of the Holy Trinity. Not all demons are equally susceptible to the three persons of the Holy Trinity individually, or the saints, or the Blessed Mother under her various titles. Priests who deal with this can tell you there are the diabolical entities which are affected adversely by the Eucharist and those which are not. Not so much. So there's a specificity, there's a personality, there's a uniqueness to these diabolical entities. And so when you see it this way, you see faith, hope, and charity. So if the demon is militating against charity, and that may have very many different aspects of it, but if the demon is militating against specifically how you feel about your neighbor or your relationship with your neighbor, which person of the Holy Trinity is under attack or the focal point? The Spirit. And so he's going to be the nemesis personality of the Holy Trinity. Does that make sense? And so you can, if you're experiencing a difficulty with despair or with hopelessness, then focus on a devotion that puts in the forefront Christ and the resurrection. Litany of the most precious blood is amazing for this. Litany to the Holy Spirit, if you're seeing the Holy having a Holy Spirit issue. Doubt. Go to those devotions which focus on God the Father. Now let's overlay on top of that the angelic realm. So St. Thomas tells us, and what I'm going to do is give you kind of a distillation or a compilation, if you would. St. Thomas, Henri Dionysius, Dionysius, Pseudo-Dionysius, all of the writers on the angelic realm, what I'm going to do is kind of condense this down, plus give back to you what has come out of our experience in solemn session. The S&D fathers, as well as other priests that we consult with, are spending over 650 to 700 hours a year in formal rite exorcism. And so it's like flying a plane. If you spend the time in the cockpit and get the experience, you see lots of stuff. And so we look for what are the commonalities that the diabolical, what do they react to, how do they speak, how do they react under interrogation. And what is amazing is you see a very specific and repeatable pattern, whether the exorcism is happening in Scandinavia or San Antonio. It's the same old shoot 'em up. It's the same cast of characters. It's the same thing. And so the theology is amazing because the demon's, it's pretty simple. The demon's not going to engage in speculative theology. He will either yield or he will not yield. Pretty simple. Father Ripperger characterizes them, and rightly so, as lawyers from hell. And so they will either yield or they will not yield. So the 9 angelic choirs are configured around the persons of the Holy Trinity in the following way. Configured around God the Father is the contemplative hierarchy. And they are made of the seraphim, cherubim, and thrones. And so you might think, Well, another statement needs to be made. St. Thomas says that one can surmise that if 1/3 of angels fell, then 1/3 of all angels fell. So 1/3 of seraphim, 1/3 of cherubim, 1/3 of thrones, etc. So that the good news is we got them outnumbered 2-1. The bad news is the good guys, the angels, do not activate unless you ask them to. So the angel will only go where he's invited. The demon will go where he's not resisted. Do you see the difference? It's a difference in disposition between a seductor and a suitor. God in the angelic realm suits your soul. They want to court you. They want you of your own free will to conform your will to theirs. The demon, on the other hand, will use two methodologies whereby he wants to conscript you or to force you or to seduce you. So let's talk about those two methodologies. Angels do not have gender. Demons do not have gender. They have two dispositions. The two dispositions are incubari and succubari, or incubus and succubus. These are not relegated to sexual sin or sexual behavior. But they are the two dispositions. One, incubari, is in your face, intimidating, controversial, confronting, and succubari is passive aggressive, manipulative. And so if you see these two attributes, you're going to recognize in them two very prominent personalities that we see in the human race. And a good example is in the marriage of Ahab and Jezebel. Jezebel is the incubari. She's the forceful one. Ahab is the succubari, or the passive-aggressive, manipulative one. And so that gender can, not gender, but that disposition differentiates or helps you kind of classify what type of demon not only are you compatible with, but also that which is afflicting. So the contemplative hierarchy is made of the top three choirs, which are the seraphim, cherubim, and thrones, which contemplate God the Creator in His essence. So there are things about us, St. Thomas would classify them as specifics or accidentals. And so the specifics are those things about us which God chose. And they are at the core of our identity. And so the specifics of a particular human person are what? Gender, ethnicity, historic era, culture. Because after all, how did your soul arrive? God, who does nothing randomly, sent your soul specifically to the conception. He chose your gender. He chose your family. He chose the epoch or time in history. He chose your culture. And this is one of the first things that the demon attacks, is that very identity, the specifics of your identity chosen by God. How many of you have ever heard that? You were born in the wrong time in history, the wrong gender, to the wrong people. All of us have heard variations on this. The question is, do we respond? If you respond, now you've got a relationship. So all of the discussion about gender dysphoria, all of these discussions are going to be of interest. You're psychologically compatible with some extremely heavy hitters. And if the demon can convince you, and you can start having the dialogue of finding fault with God, specifically in these specifics of your creation, then he can make great use of you. Yes?
I should add that psyche is the Greek word for soul, too. That's where it comes from, the word psyche. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I'm serious.
And so the point being is that once that discussion is started, once that relationship is started, now you find fault with God. And so the demon has very little interest in us personally. What he has is a great interest in us in the economy of damnation, which is a counterfeit of the economy of salvation. So what he wants to know is, how can he use us in the same way that any utilitarian creature looks at how can I use this particular thing as a tool. So he doesn't have the interest in us specifically as much as he does in how we can be used to disrupt or interrupt the flow of grace. So the next group is centered around the Son, and this is governance, the hierarchy of governance. And in this is the dominions, virtues, and powers. So incidentally, with regard to Christ the Son, just a little bit of divergence, is that there are two tangible aspects of Christ the Son that are inseparable. And so he is, he's the second person of the Holy Trinity which has a corporal existence. He's the only person of the Holy Trinity that has this definitive corporal existence. He was here for 33 years. So in the East, the imagery that they use is that the finger of God touched the fabric of time at 3 o'clock on Friday afternoon, and that touch lasts 33 years. So they would tell you that the Annunciation was 3 o'clock on Friday afternoon, and his death was at 3 o'clock on Friday afternoon. That the Annunciation and Good Friday are the same day, 33 years apart. And so it's this imagery that the finger of God touched the fabric of time, and so that Christ is finite. The second person of the Holy Trinity is finite in that corporal existence for those 33 years. Then when he dies and ascends, he leaves two tangible things that are with us still. What are those two tangible things? One is the church. And the other is the Blessed Virgin Mary. So in possession cases, one of the things that we find that is universal is that there is at least one defective Marian dogma, and that there is an inconsistency or a problem with the integrity of the sacramental life. This is necessary for possession. And so once you repair the sacramental life, once you return the soul to the state of grace, and you correct the defect in the Marian dogma, now the soul is in a position it can be liberated. But until that happens, you're not going to achieve liberation. So the sacraments, very simply, the sacraments are central to exorcism and deliverance. Any methodology that proposes to deliver one from extraordinary diabolical affliction or possession that does not include the sacraments is not going to be long-term sustainable or, in fact, true liberation. Because the definition of that healing has to be reconciliation with God the Father. Yes?
You said Marian dogma, there's 4, right?
Correct.
What are those?
Oh, are you a plant? And so the 4 Marian dogmas in order are, one is Theotokos, Mother of God. Number 2 is perpetual virginity. Number 3 is Immaculate Conception. And number 4 is the Assumption. And so what happens is there's some defect in the dogma. Now there's also 3 subsequent doctrines yet to be declared dogma, and many theologians say that when the 7th is declared dogmatic, that will be the end of time. For your discussion, those 3 doctrines are, Father mentioned one of them today, they are mediatrix of all graces, co-redemptrix, and the Salve Regina, or the Queen of Heaven. And so Queen of Heaven we're most familiar with because St. Dominic included it in the mysteries of the Rosary. But the other 2, co-redemptrix and mediatrix, these go back to the 600s and 700s. These are not Johnny-come-lately thoughts about the Blessed Mother. They've been in and out of popularity. You can see oftentimes the spiritual atmosphere with regard to what is the current thought and talk about these doctrines of the Blessed Mother, even among our own prelates and hierarchy. And so that gives a real commentary on the state of the church or the state of any given group of individuals. So these two things that, and this is functional John 6. Jesus speaking, no one comes to the Father unless no one comes to the Father unless the Father beckons. No one comes to the Father unless he comes through me, Jesus speaking. So we see that there's really, St. Thomas said, tertium non datur, there's no third way. There's no other way other than through the Christ, the sacraments of the church. Succinctly said, and one problematic doctrine is there's no salvation outside the church. So this governance hierarchy, we see very few possessions by this contemplative hierarchy. Very few possessions. But we see a lot of possessions by demons who possess in the name of these greater demons, these greater creatures. Demons always name up. They never name down. And so they always claim to be something greater or more significant than they are. And so these guys do show up to defend cases. So if you've got a case of a Satanist, satanic high priest, you'll have Beelzebub, you'll have Baphomet, you'll have several different Baal, you'll have several different demons show up to argue the case. For those of you who recognize the reference, it's a lot like Johnny Cochran. They show up in a fancy suit and tassel loafers, and they're just there to argue the case. And so it's really frustrating for the exorcists because you can't pin these guys down. And the minute it starts, you turn the heat up on them a little bit, they're gone. And so there's a lesser demon possessing in their name. Among those are the ones that I named. And so, but in the governance hierarchy, on the governance choirs, dominions, virtues, and powers, this is where most of the possessing entities are. They come out of these choirs, and they are in direct opposition to the governance of Christ, Jesus Christ as Lord. And so they're in direct opposition to Christ's role, Christ's church, and the Blessed Mother. And so this is where the majority of the possessors come from. Now we're going to get over here to these, what we call the afflicting spirits. They're out of the ministering hierarchy, because these were created as ministering angels. Angels that give comfort, angels that give aid, angels that give solace, angels that give strength. But these are the principalities archangels and angels. And you have a few possessors out of here, but for the most part, these are the demons that are involved in curses. These are the demons that are involved in malefice. These are the demons of conscription. These are the demons that are sent somewhere at the insertion of a greater demon. So the way a practitioner of witchcraft works is they've got some kind of agreement with a dominion class demon that commands lesser demons. Now, on the diabolical side, there's no such thing as affinity, admiration, loyalty, any of that. The only reason one demon serves another is out of intimidation and fear, out of conscription. It's literally dog eat dog. So lesser demons are conscripted by greater demons and are inserted into people through satanic rite, ritual, formalized witchcraft, various other methodologies. So these are the afflicting, the demons of affliction come from and were once angels of ministry, or ministering angels. Does that make sense? When you can kind of see it that way? Okay. So, where do I want to go with this? So let's look at a little bit of an overlay, a Thomistic overlay, with regard to how St. Thomas views the human person. St. Thomas views the human person the same way the diabolical views us, so it's pretty functional. Now, for those of you, are there any formally trained Thomists in the room? If so, I'm apologizing. So, what I'm about to give you is a very stylized version, just the functional version of the faculties of the human person. So the faculties of the human person start with intellect, will, memory, emotion, appetite, or desire, and instinct.
I'll fix that for you. Carry on. Oh,
Test, check, 1, 2, 3, 4. Testing.
that may do it. This connection may have come loose a little bit.
Okay.
Your will was willing.
The mind was weak. So intellect, will, memory, emotion, appetite, and instinct, these top two faculties are what give us reason or make us rational. That's what makes us rational. So the rational quality is in these two faculties, which have no corporal nexus, no corporal essence. All of the rest of the faculties have a corporal component. What do I mean by that? I mean they have a flesh component to them. So for instance, your memory can be affected by injury. You can have a brain injury, thereby affecting your memory. You can also have injury or an emotional instability as a result of a physical condition. And then on down the line. The point being is the demon has license to afflict us in our flesh. He may not possess the soul. He may possess the flesh. He may afflict the flesh. But that means he's relegated to these faculties. The only way he can affect these faculties, the top two, are through the lower faculties. How does he do this? The primary way he does this is through an attack on the instinct and fear. The first rotten fruit of the fall, the first rotten fruit of sin is fear. Immediately elevates instinct above intellect. If you've ever been scared and ran into a door or a wall, how many of this has ever happened to you? We do stupid stuff when we're afraid. This is a classic example. And so in this panic, in this loss of the higher faculties, instinct is elevated over intellect. A classic example of when this is ineffective is in the martyr. The martyr is absolutely collected and his faculties are integrated correctly because he knows in his intellect that harm of the corpus does not mean finality, or he's not afraid of what's going to happen to him. And so willingness to suffer, the Catholic understanding of the willingness to suffer, the willingness to join our suffering to Christ, our experience to Christ, is going to be key in ordering and keeping these faculties ordered. Also, from a societal standpoint, we're insane because our faculties are disordered. Why? We feel. We don't think, and we base our decisions on how we feel. And so anytime you elevate a lower faculty over a higher faculty and then make decisions based out of that lower faculty, that is by definition disordered. So the demon is looking for the person who is disordered in their faculties, or that he can quickly and easily disorder. They're extremely lazy. They're also extremely efficient. What I mean by that? What I mean is a demon's not going to possess if he can control you through oppression. If he can control you through a lesser means, then that's all he's after. That make sense? So we're actually seeing fewer formal possessions modernly. We're seeing a lot more effective oppressions and obsessions, whereby vocations, sacraments, conduits of grace, disruption of grace, all of these things are being carried out on a grand scale with very little effort by the demon. Because we're like an anthill. He kind of comes by every once in a while, kicks us, and then we're good for about a month's worth of disruption. And so that's essentially how he is thwarting the flow of grace, thwarting the action of the church, thwarting sacramental economy. So another element of this that bears discussion is the whole discussion of repressed memories, the whole situation of how we process trauma. And so this emotion-memory interface is really important to realize and to think about, and in ourselves to police this emotion and memory interface. Also the understanding in our psyche, our psychology, that memories are cross-referenced. So if you view your memories as a file, the demon can be present to your memories. He cannot read your thoughts if they're occurring here. But he is the world's greatest actuary, meaning he's lived with us hand and hoof since the beginning of time. He knows statistically what you will do. He knows that if you're a 32-year-old woman with 4 children and your husband leaves you, that you're going to be most susceptible to destroy the marriage at 6 months, 4 days after he left. Why? Because it's happened a jillion times, and statistically that's how it happens. So he doesn't tell the future. He just reads us like a book. You know what actuary is? What is the odds of something happening? And you figure out those odds based upon past occurrences. And so this is what the demon does. And it appears that he has a vast knowledge of us, but it's simply observational. And so we're really pretty predictable in how we react to adversity. What he is not prepared for, and what he cannot comprehend in his fallen psychology, is the willingness to suffer for another, specifically for the person who's causing you the pain. He's not prepared. He can't get his psyche wrapped around this. This is why the sacrifice of Christ is so absolutely effective. And to the extent we join our suffering and our life experiences to Christ, we are in the same way effective in being purveyors of salvation. So this emotion memory interface is extremely important. The demon is quite active here. How many of you know the sibling or have a child who has a totally different memory of a common childhood or a common event? Everybody know this person? Yeah. So how does that work? It works because they choose to focus on a particular aspect of the event. So whenever they call that memory file forward and they focus only on certain things, then the margins of the memory start to fade. Again, the focus becomes the person and their perceived offense, their perceived victimhood, and so it starts to take on a more and more negative connotation. Does that make sense? So this is how memories get deformed. This is how the diabolical is present to memories. And let's suppose that one of the trigger or cross-references is rejection. How many of you have ever been in a situation where you experienced a rejection or a betrayal, and then immediately you're proffered all the other corresponding memories of when that's happened to you before? You ever notice that? And then the sensory thing that goes with it. And so, how did you deal with it before? So if you binge ate, or if you binge drank, or if you did something to alter reality, then immediately that's offered as, okay, that worked for you before, let's do it again. Does that sound familiar? So this is how we have psychological compatibility with the diabolical through this emotion-memory interface. How do you heal memories? We always talk about the healing of memories. How many of you have had a situation, a catastrophic event, lost a job, lost a loved one, something happened, and at the moment you said, it was the worst possible thing that could have happened. 6 months later, you're saying it's the best thing that could have happened to me. How many of you had that? All of us. What happened between is the same event. We begin to give thanks to God. We begin to conform ourselves to the new reality in light of thanksgiving to God. The quicker you can do that, the quicker this memory is purified and healed, and the quicker the emotion and memory interface is healed. So the ability to quickly do that keeps you from becoming vulnerable to the enemy. Make sense? Okay, good. So to understand this is one of the things that we do in working with people who are under diabolical affliction, is to realize that you have to constantly work on reestablishing and maintaining the right order of faculties. How you see things, how you go through things. And what you're going to look at too is, let's look at two words. And these are two words that the demon really likes to use a lot. And he gets a lot of help from secular psychology. And those two words are violence and trauma. So I would propose to you that if we take the language back, violence is objective, trauma is subjective. Violence means the damage done to the integrity of a corpus, a body. It can also mean the damage done to a psyche or a psychology. Trauma is the long-term or the lasting psychological and or physiological effect of an event, which may or may not be traumatic. So it's subjective, it's not objective. To illustrate my point, let's go to the passion. Is there any doubt in anyone's mind that the passion was not a violent act? It's absolutely violent. Look at what was done to the corpus of our Lord. It was absolutely violent by anyone's definition. So it's objective. Was it traumatic? Was it traumatic to our Lord? Did it have a lasting psychological impact on it? I would propose it was not traumatic. Because there's no resistance to the event. There's no offense. There's no personalization. Classic example is, does he mention it when he appears in the upper room? Does he say, hey, where were you guys? He never mentions it.
He knew it was coming.
Even if he doesn't know it's coming, he's conformed to his Father's holy will in such a way that he doesn't take it personally. The Blessed Mother, do you think she was traumatized?
Yes.
I do not. No resistance. Be it done to me according to thy will. The point being made is that in the conformity of wills, that we're going to feel offense or not feel offense. If we're totally conformed to God's will, we realize that most of what's happening to us is not personal. And so there's no offense, there's no resistance. The Blessed Mother she's not resistant to what's happening. Mary Magdalene is traumatized. She's on the ground. She's bereft. She's in travail. She's crying because she's experiencing what's happening at the cross, in a very personal way. Does that make sense? So you look at people who go through great and horrific abuse and are functioning on the other side. It's because they're not experiencing the trauma, the lasting psychological effect. In order for there to be lasting psychological effect in a place where a demon can lodge, there has to be his perception of offense. What erases that, what purifies that memory is forgiveness. Charity, the desire for salvation for the other soul, the Maria Goretti response. So when you see it that way, it helps. Is there an eraser?
Oh, that's all you have to say.
Okay, then I'm done. I wanted to expound, first. I wanted to expound on this one concept. Thank you very much. Okay. I want to expound on this one concept because inevitably psychological compatibility with the demon, what forms a relationship, is the sense of offense, the sense of injustice. And so virtue is extremely important in the spiritual life. St. Thomas talks about the four cardinal virtues of prudence, and in this order, is they are to be cultivated and explored in this order: prudence, temperance, fortitude, and justice. So he identifies prudence as knowing what to do and when to do it. Now, what St. Thomas doesn't include in all these definitions is the phrase, to achieve the good. So what is the good? The ultimate good is God himself, but to achieve the good is relationship with God. So prudence is knowing what to do and when to do it in order that one might achieve relationship with God. So these are both intellect and will. You see, the intellect is the knowing what to do. The will is when to do it. But how often do we stop short? We get the intellectual part, we know what to do, but either the when to do it or we lack following through. And so prudence is the first one. The second one is temperance. He defines temperance as the moderation of the attraction of created goods, including creatures. So we're to moderate even our attraction for created goods. Father Ripper takes and delineates the four cardinal virtues into 64 daughters. If you would like for him to have some of this information, or if you have questions for me, you can email me at info@delorens.org. But the 64 daughters gives you a good and clear way to see how the virtues are arranged under the four cardinal or mother virtues. Why do you suppose the imagery of daughters? How many of you know a family with multiple daughters? Each one of those daughters represents the mother in its specificity, but none of them are the mother. So each one of them is a facet. It's good that you raise your hand, because I always tell young men, if you're going to have a relationship with a woman, you have to have a relationship with her mother and her sisters. And if you do not, this will not go well. And so the virtues are woven together in such a way, in such a tapestry, as you cannot pursue one virtue to the exclusion of another. And one begets another. One augments and accentuates another. So prudence, temperance, the moderation of the attraction of created goods and creatures. Fortitude, the willingness to engage the arduous. The willingness to engage the arduous. Commitment. St. Alphonsus Liguori says that with regard to discernment and vocation, God does not bless the choice. Modernly, we think we have to make the right choice. St. Alphonsus says not so. What he says is God blesses the commitment. Once you choose, don't look back. Be all in. Take your hand from the plow and don't look back. And so that's how one is blessed in vocation, is through the commitment. Fortitude, willingness to engage the arduous. And within fortitude are courage and perseverance and various other, various other daughters. And then the final one is justice. To render unto each his due. And so what is the primary each or the other? Who is the primary? First is God. All justice has to have a vertical relationship before it can have a horizontal relationship. So all justice must flow from God, be due to God, before we can extend it to our fellow man. If you'll notice, most of us are experts in justice without a clue of these which precede it. And so the overdeveloped sense of justice to the exclusion of the previous virtues puts you in a very dangerous position, because the demon is all about telling you what other people got coming. And so that gives you an idea, an overlay of the virtues. How are we doing for time, Father?
10 after 4.
Don't want to bore anyone. We can keep going, but I'll show you, we'll talk about one more thing that's very valuable in counseling the possessed and those that are afflicted, and then I'll open it to questions. Fair enough? All right. So this is the final imagery that I want to leave you with, and that is this, is there are 3 people at the foot of the cross. And there is a movement from pain through suffering to sorrow. So pain is that acute response to a perceived offense. It is the sharp intake of breath. It is the acute response. Mary Magdalene, of the 3 people at the foot of the cross, Mary Magdalene epitomizes the pain response. Sacred art shows her in travail. Most sacred art will not show her with a halo at the foot of the cross because she's not behaving in a saintly way. She's in great travail. They're destroying the corpus of the only man who ever loved her, her exorcist, he who understood her. And essentially, pain is the response, what effect is this having on me? Oftentimes, the death of a loved one, the pain response is, how is this going to affect me? So the pain response is a personal response. It's our response to the event. And it is a traumatic response because wrapped up in the pain response is 2 things. One, the feeling of offense. The second one is resistance. Pain is born out of resistance. This is why the Blessed Mother is not the painful mother. We see her depicted with 7 swords in her heart, pierced by 7 swords. And she is the sorrowful mother. She's not the painful mother. Because there's no resistance. Her fiat, be it done unto me according to thy word. And it's total conformity of will. And so we can linger in the pain response inevitably as long as we choose. But we must move out of that of our own accord. Tincture of time does not cure the pain response. Many of us have had events that have happened to us that are just as vivid today as they were years ago when they happened. And we can go through that emotion-memory interface in an unhealthy way, and the pain is just as acute right now as it was however many years ago. And so this is not healthy. Modern psychology encourages us to vent. Vent is neither charitable nor curative. If you're confessing the sins of another to the exclusion of your own, this is not beneficial, either psychologically or spiritually. And so it's this understanding that we have to move out of pain, and then suffering is pain with purpose. In suffering, we start to shift from why is this happening to how can I use it? How can I use it to grow in sanctity? How can I use it to purify my own inordinate or disordered desires? So St. John epitomizes suffering. It is compassion. He's not arguing with what's happening. He's participating in it. Jesus said, "It is my Father's will that I should suffer and die." And he's doing it, and John's suffering with him. He's not crying out, "It's not fair, Lord." That's a pain response. He's there supporting the Blessed Mother and supporting his friend, suffering with him, watching. Where are the other apostles? There's something that precedes this, and this is called fear. They don't even want to be in the near occasion of pain. The cowardice overwhelms them. They can't even be in the presence. At least Mary Magdalene is there. John is there. They're in the presence. They're in the act. They're in the passion. So St. John epitomizes suffering. He's there for his friend all the way to the end. The Blessed Mother epitomizes sorrow. Sorrow is glorified suffering. Of all the people at the foot of the cross, she is the one most aware of God the Father. She is the one aware of God the Father in his mercy and love is offering his Son. And that all of this is due in justice. In justice to God. That it is not only inevitable, but it is in fact merciful. And it is necessary. And it is the height of piety. So sorrow, there's no resistance. And there is a love of us for love of God that cost her her Son. She, no less than God the Father, are giving their only Son for us. And so this is sorrow. So this movement from pain to suffering to sorrow, we see this. It's amazing what happens in the journey of the possessed person. Because they're totally focused on themselves. They're in pain. Excuse me. Many of them ask me, why is this happening? And by the end of the liberation, it's all about God. It is all about God. So there's been this beautiful purification that in many ways could not be brought about in another way. We've had people who are possessed who they suffer horribly. And at the end of the session they will say, when can we do this again? Because they recognize the power of reparation, the power of redemptive suffering, the power of God's justice served through physical affliction. Christ came and suffered and died for us. He didn't come and sing and dance us to salvation. He suffered and died. And ultimately, the application of our suffering, the application of our physical experience to his salvific sacrifice, that's where liberation is. That's where reconciliation with God the Father is. And that is at the very heart of spiritual combat, because the demon wants to do everything he possibly can to keep you from joining your suffering to the Christ, from joining your suffering to the mystical body of Christ. And so that's what I have. Those are the observations. I'd be happy to try to answer or address any questions that you might have. Yes?
How does generational spirit work?
Generational spirits. So let's talk about them for a moment. In the literature and in our discussion, there are two types of generational spirits. There is another type of spirit which many people confuse as generational spirits. They're called familial spirits. Let's talk about them first, then go to generational spirits. So the familial spirits tend to be of the lowest hierarchy. Those three that were ministering or now afflicting. Those tend to be the familial spirits. And those familial spirits are those that live with families. And so they're exterior to the individual, but interior to the family. What are some examples of familial spirits? Divorce, suicide, addiction. And so it's a deviant or vicious behavior which has been done by multiple members of the family, which from a psychological standpoint makes it now an option for anybody in the family. What does it look like? Whenever there's difficulty in my marriage, I'm having difficulty in my marriage. After all, my brother divorced or my father divorced. Therefore, it's an option for me. You see what I mean? And you can see it when it comes into a family. I'll give you a classic example. In my family, my father, through my father's generation, there was zero, not any divorce. Going all the way back, there was never anyone who had ever been divorced for however many generations that was. In my strata, half of us cousins were divorced. And now their children, it's going to be about 80%. And the way that got into the family was, my cousins married some people that divorce was already in their family. It was already an option. And so this is one of the things you really need to talk about with potential spouses. Is there divorce in your family? In other words, if it gets tough, are you going to think about checking out of this location? That's an example of a familial spirit. Various addictions, suicide, other things are examples of familial
Could
spirit.
freemasonry be part of that?
Freemasonry is a true generational spirit. We'll talk about that one when we get to generational spirits, but familial spirits, yes.
Well, I was going to say, do you know the reasons why these people got divorced? Was there addiction? Was there physical abuse? Was there emotional abuse?
Okay, so the
I'm just
reason,
saying, I want to.
They could have been transplanted from one culture into another too.
so the point that I'm making is there's a difference between a reason and an excuse.
Okay. Okay.
And I'd really like to make that point because a reason is in the rational quality. An excuse is something that we want to excuse a certain behavior. So infidelity is not a reason for divorce. Bottom line, we're Catholics. Come on, guys, this is where the rubber meets the road. This is the tough stuff.
What about addiction? And what about abuse?
These are not reasons for divorce.
Really? So somebody can get, so a woman can get beat up and.
You may have need to stop the behavior, but divorce is a finality. And so this is I don't think you really want to have this discussion in this forum.
No, that's fine.
And so the point being is the demon is all about us wanting to get, or telling us we need to get out or escape or fracture a vocation because of something that's happening to us. And it's much bigger than that. It's much, much bigger than that. So the familial sin is the demon that, or the familiar demon is one that counsels vicious behavior in response to adversity, rather than virtuous behavior in response to adversity. So that's the touchstone on familiar spirits. Generational spirits, 2 times. First time is the spirit that affects a generation, meaning a group of people, a zeitgeist, a spirit of the age, if you will. So in the 60s it was lust, in the 70s it was greed, or in the 80s it was greed, various spirits. And then we tend to name people like Generation Xers or millennials, and they will have a certain communal disposition, but they're also open to particular generational spirits or zeitgeist. Now let's go to the generational spirit classification that is Freemasonry and other forms of formalized witchcraft. In these generational spirits, these are in the governance hierarchy. They're more possessors. And so what has happened there is someone, an ancestor, has made an agreement, a formalized agreement, and pledged descendants to a diabolical entity for a particular power or a particular attribute. This is the Freemasonic curse. And so this allows the demon to be present to the bloodline. And so when this is called a generational spirit, it is the generation of humans, regeneration or procreation. So think generation in that way, the generative principle. It follows the generative principle and it possesses a bloodline. Demons don't see us the way we see ourselves. They're out of time and place. They're out of it's not that they're omnipresent, not at all, but if they're possessing a bloodline, then they may be present to multiple individuals within the same family over generations. You see how that can work? And so these are the curses of Freemasonry in various forms of formalized satanic activity and witchcraft. So there's the short riff on generational
I
spirits.
just have a question. Because my father always told me that Freemasons don't like Catholics. You know, he told me that a long, long, long time ago. So Freemasonry wouldn't be generational in Catholicism, would it?
All right, you keep this can. In 1471, Cardinal Torquemada uncovered a group of people who identified themselves as the Illuminados. This was during the Spanish Inquisition. This group of people was comprised of Jewish merchants, mid-level Spanish noblemen, and Mohammedans. Listen to that mixture. The common enemy that they have is the Catholic Church. And so the Illuminati, or the Illuminados, first identified as a group subversive to the Church in 1471. In 1717, the Grand Lodge was formed. This was the codification and unification of freemasonic lodges and practices. It was done in Paris, France in 1717. 300 years later, or 200 years later, we got the Blessed Mother that appears at Fatima with direct emphasis to Freemasonry. We've got Maximilian Kolbe and others. But essentially what Freemasonry does is it sets itself against the church, against altar and crown. That was its purpose. That's why it was formed. In 1717, Grand Orient Lodge is organized, and in 1738, a scant 21 years later, which is a blink of an eye in Vatican times, we get the first papal edict or letter that says that a Catholic, if he joins Freemasonry, would result in excommunication. So in the 300 years since that time, that first papal edict, there have been over 35 bulls, motu proprios, and official documents that say a Catholic may not be a member of a Freemasonic organization. Freemasonry has as its accomplishments the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, the Mexican Revolution. And so there was a fracturing of altar and crown. The last coronated ruler to be murdered was Archduke Ferdinand in Austria, which started the First World War. So it's just been a constant movement. Yes?
So you said they're set against kings, right?
Say again?
You said they're set against kings, right?
Coronated rulers, whether that's a duke, whether that's a baron, but there was a unification of church and state. And so the popes and bishops were unified with the temporal ruler within a given area.
First of all, thank you very much. This has been very, very informative. I have two questions. The first one is, if you give your fallen away adult children St. Benedict blessed medals, will that help in any kind of keeping them from any kind of obsession, possession, bad behavior? And the second one is, and I think you kind of already answered it for me, I have Father Rivers' layman's prayers, deliverance prayers, and in the back of it, he has an appendix where he lists sins, vices, and whatever. And what is back cracking? What is that all about? So, I mean, I can understand the bipolar and all the mental illnesses and all the other average, things.
He's like, that's part
Yeah,
of that.
back cracking. Anyway, those are my questions.
So what he's talking about within that section, if you look within that section, is it's laying on of hands and the familiarity of touching people that we don't have any reason or authority to touch. And so culturally, within certain societies and certain groups, this is a thing, and it shouldn't be done. But it goes to the familiarity of touching and laying on of hands is essentially what it amounts to. With regard to your first question, with regard to the St. Benedict medals, the sacrament is not going to be effective other than to agitate the diabolical and to remind the righteous. So it'll have that effect.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So if you know of a Freemason in the family, you say, and we were advised once that we were to find out exactly what rite they were in, which is difficult to find out. And so you say all the prayers in the back of the book, and in what setting? With a priest? Do you ask the priest to say for your family?
So it's a very good question. So here is the answer to that in its totality, and that is this. Anymore, it's very difficult. They mix and match rites and observances, and so you don't have the purity of practice that you used to have. So what we advise is that if you suspect Masonic involvement, you need to say all the prayers. The other one is to remember that it follows the bloodline, it follows the generative principle. So the ranking male in that line is the one who says it to interrupt the curse. If the person saying the renunciations is the Mason, then he needs to go to confession and he needs to do the renunciations in the presence of a priest. If the person making the renunciation is not the active Mason, the son or the grandson, then he does not need to say it in the presence of a priest. But the prayers need to be said three repetitions. recommend that they be done on 3 consecutive Sundays.
3 consecutive.
So it said a generational spiritual, so this previous system is like a generational thing, right? Like, when you say that, you mean it like runs in the DNA? Like the DNA
blood.
first?
The blood. So the bloodline is what is being possessed. Because it is the bloodline that has been proffered or offered. And so another good observation with regard to Freemasonry is Freemasonry creates nothing. It borrows from everything. So that when a man goes in the lodge, no matter what his ethnicity, what his home religion, what that is, he's going to see a symbol, he's going to see something that's familiar to him. Everything from Hindu to Muslim, it's all going to be in there in some form or another. Various forms of witchcraft. So I'll give you a classic example, is Pelican witchcraft is listed as one of the practices in Freemasonry. The person may have a reaction to the term Pelican witchcraft. If it does not, if the affliction does not dissipate post-renunciation, it may be Pelican witchcraft from another source. So what I'm saying is it may not have come through Freemasonry. Does that make sense? Rosicrucianism is another one. Rosicrucianism exists independently of Freemasonry. So what's afflicting the person may have come through Freemasonry, or it may have come independently. Does that make sense?
What are Wiccans? Are Wiccans in the Freemasonry realm?
Freemasonry doesn't reference Wicca or Wiccans. They're a form of witchcraft that's not within Freemasonry, and it's called Dianic witchcraft or elemental witchcraft. And so it's elemental witchcraft. It doesn't necessarily, the Wiccans don't go to the level of blood witchcraft.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can you speak on the Jesuit order and their relationship with Freemasonry?
I think you pretty well said it. So bottom line is there's a very strong correlation between various orders within the church, and there are many Freemasons which have been prelates, and we currently have Freemasons which are prelates within the church, bishops, cardinals, and others. Simon Wiesenthal was a Jesuit who is largely responsible for a lot of the rites, rituals, and internal structure of Freemasonry. And so he was both Jesuit and Mason at the same time. He's not the only one. We've got a lot of instances. I think one of the classic examples of Jesuit influence is that which came through Angelic and the deformation of the liturgy. And so these are known things. People will say, are you a conspiracy theorist? I'm no theorist. I'm no theorist. It is conspiracy. It's clear to track.
You said that the group identified themselves in 1471, correct? Wasn't that around the time of the Converso crisis? Where you had fake converts? That was another reason for the Inquisition.
Well,
People were converting, and then they would still practice Judaism or something.
may well be. Torquemada's.
So, yeah, when you say Freemasonry, I think a lot of it's probably that too. I don't think they actually have to be Freemason. They can just adopt the same behavior like that. Like a false belief or like lackluster conversion.
So Torquemada was charged with finding the enemies of the church in southern Spain. And so when in the Inquisition he finds these, and so you look to the church's records. What was he finding? What was he seeing? And so you read the church's records on that. That's where this mention comes from. It's a highly organized group. Each one of them had their own reason, but essentially the scriptural reference is, and the Pharisees and Herodians became friends that very day. So once the common enemy is found being the church, and then this organization, the secret society, forms to go against the church. It's not that they kept some of their beliefs when they converted. They're actually actively trying to subvert the
Well,
church.
if they keep beliefs that contradict the Catholic truth, they're already in opposition. I mean, it's true. It's at that point, it's like Gnostic thinking. You can't have two reconcile two opposites.
I'm sorry, I'm not seeing your point.
Well, I mean, what I'm saying is they don't have to be Freemasons. They can just hold on to things that from their previous life before the conversion. One could.
So Torquemada is not concerning himself with incomplete conversion. He's concerning himself with active enemies of the church that are set about to destroy the church. And so, to address what you're talking about, you look at what is in conversion, what is in scrutinies. We get some of these cases where people keep pagan practices and other things, syncretism, other things that are inconsistent with the Catholic faith. Then once they come into the church, these start to become problematic. And so there's the problematic in practice of the faith. It's not that they're actively trying to subvert the church.
I really like what you said about angels and fallen angels, in that angels are there for you. You just have to ask for their help. And the fallen angels are just looking for a way to get into your soul. I grew up always thinking that I had a guardian angel. My mom always told me that. I truly believe that one of my sons would have been dead 1,000 times if he didn't have a guardian angel. But what is there? I mean, is that something that we should think about, or is something that we do have? Do we have a guardian angel that is assigned to us?
Yes, and this is accepted church doctrine. Ludwig Ott talks about it, St. Thomas talks about it, but it's in the, and it's a little beyond speculative theology, meaning that it's a little bit more formalized than a speculative theology element, is that each soul is assigned a guardian angel. And so the differentiation is, or the debate, what is speculative about it is that angel assigned at baptism or at birth? And then there's some argument about it possibly being at conception. But no matter which way you follow it, all are in agreement that by the time we're baptized, there is a guardian of our soul, which is of an angelic class. And so then that angel accompanies your soul until it either returns to a particular judgment, essentially. So we do well to ask the counsel, to light, to guard, to guide, to ask the counsel of our guardian angel, to allow our conscience to be pricked by the guardian angel. You are also dispatched angels at various other times in your life, such as vocation, fatherhood. Father has a vocation angel, marrieds have a vocation angel. Bishops will receive a principality class angel that will have not only his office, but his the geographical area. Now that angel, if he moves, that angel doesn't move with him. And so these principality class angels are over a particular geography. There's an angel assigned to this church. And so there's angelic entities that are here to aid and help us in our responsibility for souls and in our distribution of grace. And so, yeah, you've got all kinds of help. They're out of those lower choirs, those ministering choirs, but the other side of those are some of the most active demons, which are the afflicting demons.
So if people that aren't religious or aren't faithful, they have a guardian angel, but there's really nothing they can do because they're not appreciated or know that they're there, or have demons come in and push them away from the soul that they're supposed to be.
St. Thomas says they occupy the place of counsel. And so he's very specific in what is a counselor. Is essentially a counselor is someone who will advise you if you ask, but they will offer nothing unless you do ask.
So we need to pray to our guardian angel.
Precisely. Yes?
I had a couple of questions. So first of all, one thing I've heard exorcists mention as kind of a way to open that the demons can get in is through music. So are there certain genres of music that are objectively sinful or demonic? And then, how do we know the difference? And then also, can we as Catholics then support the American Revolution if it was Masonic?
So revolution, I'll answer the second question first. Revolution is not a Catholic concept, quite simply. And so revolution is not a Catholic concept, very simply. And so there was a properly designated and coronated ruler. And so revolution is not a Catholic concept, so that's the first question. Also, the understanding, this was never a Catholic country. I think for someone to say that we were founded as a Catholic country is disingenuous, because we weren't founded on Catholic principles. Very simple. Be that as it may, there are many countries that are not Catholic, in which Catholics live. Back to your music question. Very simply, I'll give you two genres, and then you tell me one is heavy metal and the other one is Gregorian chant. Do these have equal merit? Absolutely not. And so discordant noise, it's the same as art. In order for it to be art, beautiful, it must be good and true. It must have these elements that draw us toward the symmetry of creation, the beauty of God, and ultimately toward God, the Creator. Music should do the same. It should lift the soul. It should lift the psyche. It should lift us. It should give us contemplation of God, heaven, these things which are sacred in nature. And so that's the true purpose of art, if you will. It's the true purpose of music. And so there was a time when almost all art and all music served the faith. We're in a great departure from that. So I hope that answers your question. Yes, Bob. Oh, I'm sorry.
Just to pick up on John's question about the American Revolution. Russell Kirk and various others argue that it wasn't a true revolution because there was not an attempt to turn upside down the social order. In fact, English common law was adopted wholesale and nothing changed, and courts and so forth. But it was a revolt from a particular authority that, and the authority of the rest of the structure did not come from that authority. King George came from God. At least that was the idea. Could you say a little more about the Masonic twist?
So what Masonic, one of the nefarious nature of Masonry is to expound upon the Luciferian concepts of entitlement. And so to give you an example of Luciferian language, we find it in the preamble of the Constitution. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, written by slave owners that were denying the right to vote to certain other men. So you see what I mean? And so the language has a very emotional appeal, but it falls down functionally. Is it applied in that equality? And so the language of entitlement, we find the language of entitlement in Islam. We find the language of Luciferian entitlement in all kinds of subversive things. Freemasonry uses it, which it is the language of Ishmael. It is the language of the delayed birthright. It is the language that somehow nobility can be achieved through politics. And not so. Nobility is a function of character, not public or popular affirmation. And so that's Pope Leo XIII says it when he says, right is right even when no one is. So, thank you, Father. Yes?
You mentioned Islam. I think Muslim countries, like, they outlaw any sort of secret society.
Say it again?
They're totally banned. Any sort of secret society in Muslim countries is banned. And they don't tolerate it. I'm just saying it's interesting. You mentioned the Luciferian part, but I think that, like, secrecy, the Freemasonic part of it, maybe not so much, because their culture, the is entirely Arabic.
First of all, Islamic culture is not monolithic. Islamic culture is not monolithic.
Yeah, I know it's not monolithic. It's monolithic in the sense that it's culturally hegemonic. It's Arabic wherever it goes. It tends to the Arabic wherever it goes.
The point that I'm making is what draws people into Islam is the idea of entitlement. All of it flows from Ishmael, that birthright denied, that first son but not legitimate of Abraham, and so there's that disconnect. Last call.
Does the devotion to the seven sorrows have a particular help in discerning if there's some diabolical activity?
So the question is, does the devotion to the seven sorrows have any particular help? Yes, we highly recommend the devotion to the seven sorrows. You pray to the Blessed Mother that through a prolonged devotion of the seven sorrows and the Dolor Rosary, that she'll show to you these particular areas in your life where you may have vulnerability or you may have things that are affecting you that you're not immediately aware of. But the seven sorrows is a beautiful devotion that draws you deeper into the life of Mary. And I think it's a good familial devotion. And I would recommend it during particular liturgical seasons to replace your daily rosary, or maybe to augment in addition to your daily rosary. But the Servite rosary is extremely powerful in exposing one to the Blessed Mother and some of her insights.
The Servite rosary is different from the devotion.
Same. I'm using it interchangeably. So the order that perpetuates the seven sorrows are called the Servites. And so,
Thank you so very much.
you're very welcome. Thank you for having me. Okay, I will.